Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game Esoteric Entertaining Series, The Port Authority, where we weigh some of my favorite arcade games against their home console counterparts. And if you can't tell already, today we're doing Sega Rally on the Sega Model 2 as well as the Sega Saturn. And a few weeks ago I did the exact same Port Authority for Daytona USA, and I told you that that port made the Sega Saturn look like a dumpster fire that could not keep up with the PlayStation 1 in any way, shape, or form, and absolutely bought the Sega Saturn a ton of bad press at the beginning of its life, making people think that it couldn't handle 3D. The good thing is Sega Rally is the exact opposite of that statement. This is the best port from Model 2 to Sega Saturn in my opinion. Of course it's going to suffer some graphical downgrades because the Sega Saturn is not a Model 2, but this game runs well, has a great frame rate, good controls, a good draw distance, and basically proved that Sega figured out how to actually port games from Model 2 to the Sega Saturn effectively once they had some time. And had this game been a launch game and not Daytona USA, I think you would have had a lot different perception in the gaming press and in gaming fans' minds as to just how good the Sega Saturn could be and how it could compare against the PlayStation 1. But honestly, it's one of those things, we can't rewrite history, we can just talk about what's going on here. If we're getting too far involved though, do me a huge favor down below, hit like and subscribe, ring that notification bell, definitely helps us out, but let's get into it. So right here on the Sega Model 2, of course we're going to have better graphical quality. There is no question whatsoever. Look at those waving flags, look at the textures, look at everything that you're seeing. There's going to be more polygons on screen, there's going to be a higher resolution for the textures. Of course that is going to be the case because the Sega Model 2 was an extremely expensive arcade board developed in part by Lockheed Martin. This is the type of hardware you wish you could have gotten at home, but had they sold a console at this price point, you're talking multiple thousands of dollars to actually get that hardware in your home. But the thing about arcade ports in the 90s was you knew you were never going to get the exact same graphical quality, but you wanted the exact same fun and the exact same experience. That's where Daytona USA fell completely flat. It ran so poorly, had such a bad frame rate and so much draw distance pop in that you just basically couldn't get into the game like you could in arcades. So go ahead and take a look at the pop in here on the Model 2, get a look at the overall texture quality, the car model quality, and everything else, because we're going to jump right over to the Sega Saturn in just a moment on the exact same area in the game. And you even get this AM2 helicopter flying in, swooping down, and then basically making a turn until we hit the first finish line. Now if we jump over to the Sega Saturn version of Sega Rally, you're going to see we have the same waving flags, maybe not as well animated, but they are there, and of course it's a different aspect ratio because it is different hardware, but you can instantaneously recognize that this is Sega Rally on Sega Model 2 except ported to Sega Saturn, where Daytona USA looked like such a mess of pixels and polygons, sometimes it was hard to even tell where the turn was going to go next. And this is exactly what the Sega Saturn was good at, 3D when it was handled well. Of course the frame rate's going to be slightly lower than Model 2, of course the textures are going to be a little bit more pixelated, and there's not going to be as much geometry on screen at once. But the reality is the fun is 100% ported over from the Sega Model 2 intact, and it is just so good for it. I am playing a different version of this game released later exclusively in Japan that added analog controller support to Sega Rally. I just think it is the preferred version of the game to play, but graphically it's identical to the port you would have gotten in North America or even the original Japanese release. And that is the reality of Sega Rally. It shows that these ports could be made, and that helicopter is going to come swooping down and make its turn just like it did on the arcade version of the game. You have absolutely every single detail brought back over to the Sega Saturn just in a lower graphical quality, and I would put Sega Rally up against any game on the PlayStation 1 as far as the overall graphical quality is concerned. I think it absolutely looks spectacular, and it's going to kind of rival things like Gran Turismo in my opinion. But back to the Sega Model 2 on the second stage here, again the only huge difference is the graphical complexity and the texture filtering. It just looks better on Model 2, but again we're talking about a 5-figure arcade board in a cabinet when it sold new versus a system like Sega Saturn that had to be consumer friendly pricing wise. I wish we saw something like Model 2 at home. That would be insane, but it would be even more expensive than the Neo Geo by magnitudes. But again, that's the reality of the Sega Saturn. It could struggle sometimes with 3D if it wasn't programmed for correctly, so trying to bring games from Model 2 over to the Saturn was always hard because you had such a big gulf between the quality of something like Model 2 and home consoles, so it was always destined to never look as good. The question was, how much worse was it going to look and perform? Where games on PlayStation that were ported from arcade a lot of times came from PlayStation-based arcade boards that had a little bit higher CPU clock speeds, or they had a little bit more RAM, but it was basically still a PlayStation 1 on an arcade board, so the ports would be way more one-to-one with each other because the base hardware was basically identical, with air quotes there. But now it's time to do the sound sample. As far as the quality is concerned, we're going to start with the Sega Saturn. We're going to move over to the Sega Model 2, so listen closely and leave me a comment and tell me, can you hear any difference, and if you can, which one you prefer. But here comes the music, so definitely listen closely. I'll be right back. Now the game's got a great soundtrack, and both of those sound samples sound good to my ear, but honestly there is a clear winner. It's down to the bassiness in the track. The Sega Saturn version just sounds better. It's got a little bit more punch and a little bit more impact, but if you feel free to disagree, go ahead and leave me that comment down below. And moving over to the third course in the game, again on Model 2, the reality is it's very easy to play both of these games today. You can download the M2 emulator, you can play these things on Medefend on the Sega Saturn side, or even the Mr. FPGA side of things. But if you're going to just sit down at a system and play, of course you're probably just going to pick the Model 2 version of the game because it's incredibly easy to pick up and play and emulate with a controller or a wheel, no issues whatsoever. But I take these things in a historical context and talk about what it would be like back in the day, and I love that car there just basically somehow lurched forward, getting a little bit of an advantage that was basically defying physics. The Sega Model 2 was absolutely the better looking and better performing game in arcades, but the reality is you could not have that type of 3D at home at this point in time. But when Sega decided to port it to the Sega Saturn, they pulled out all the stops to show that the system had the chops to take on Sony head to head and put that 3D up, because again, when I talked about Daytona USA, and if you haven't watched that, I will leave a description down below, I said that it was an absolute embarrassment for Sega to release that. It made the Sega Saturn look absolutely weak. Now here on Sega Rally, of course it's downgraded, but this makes the Sega Saturn look like as good of a 3D console as the PlayStation 1 could be when the proper developers were actually in charge. And that again is why it matters how much effort you put into games, especially the launch games, because of course developers are going to learn the hardware and get better as time goes on, so that the games that come out in year 2 or 3 of a console's lifespan are going to be way better than those launch games. And honestly, I could have kept going here, but I totally got turned around by that car and screwed over. But if you release something like Daytona USA on Sega Saturn in North America and it looks that bad, it leaves a bad taste from reviewers' mouths as well as fans' mouths, and they think that the system is basically doomed to just have games that look that bad on the console. But then you get something like the Sega Saturn version of Sega Rally and you realize that the Sega Saturn had what it took to have awesome 3D games that ran well, looked good, performed well, controlled well, and just really did show that the PlayStation 1 wasn't the only 3D game in town up until the point in time where the Nintendo 64 came out. And had Sega Rally been the launch day game that people got and not Daytona USA, it would have been a completely different story. But Sega Rally is a masterclass on how to take the concept and fun of an arcade game running on much more powerful hardware and shrink it down to run on a home console. This is every bit of good as a port as something like Ridge Racer on the PlayStation 1, and because it did come later on in the console's life cycle, I would say it's an even better game than Ridge Racer on PlayStation 1. But you tell me down below, did you have a Sega Saturn back in the day, and did you play Sega Rally? I remember getting this game used for like $20 at my local EB Games because I absolutely loved playing it in the arcades, and I played the ever-loving hell out of it all the time and absolutely love it, and still do to this day. And I've got a lot of nostalgia for the Sega Saturn version, so for me honestly it's 50-50 of a coin flip if I'm going to play the Model 2 version or the Sega Saturn version. So this port authority obviously has a clear winner as well as an asterisk. If you just want the best version of the game, you want to play the Model 2 version, you can either emulate it or buy an original arcade board if you're weird like me. But if you want to just be proven how good the Sega Saturn could be with 3D and you want that console experience, just go ahead and play the Saturn version of the game. They're both incredible, they're both fun, and they both hit exactly like they did back in the day, and it just goes to show Sega's developers could make amazing 3D 3D on the Sega Saturn. They just needed the time and the know-how to do it. But if you disagree, of course, the comment section is down below, and recommend another game to do Port Authority on, because I really like enjoying to make these. You guys like commenting and watching them, so I'm definitely going to make more. But we're done, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye-bye.